The chamber was electric. Journalists hunched over their keyboards. Delegates whispered behind their hands. The world's attention was fixed on the Capitol's Grand Hall, where an uninvited tension buzzed louder than the security drones above. And at the heart of it, two figures who couldn't have represented more different worlds. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just taken the floor, her tone sharp, her expression fixed in a calculated smirk. She adjusted her blazer, raised her voice just enough to sting, and said what many in the chamber didn't dare. "You don't represent anyone, Mr. Traoré." There was a pause, half a second, maybe less, but it echoed like gunfire in a library. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, eager for what would come next. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in a clean-cut, understated uniform, no medals, no theatrics, slowly rose from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't blink. The silence wasn't awkward, it was commanded. He stepped forward, eyes locked on AOC, but speaking beyond her, to the entire chamber, to the cameras, to every continent watching live. Then why are they cheering? The answer wasn't in the room, it was outside. Crowds had gathered across New York, Dakar, Lagos, Ouagadougou, and even Paris. They waved Burkinabe flags. They held signs that read, "Africa stands tall," and "The West doesn't speak for us." His name had become a chant, his message a symbol. Traoré's tone was not angry. It was surgical, calm, dangerous. "You speak of representation," he said, "but when I stand, my people rise. When I speak, they listen, not because they're told to. Because they choose to." He turned, addressing the room. "How many of you can say the same? How many would dare walk through your own cities without an armored car and PR team?" Ocasio-Cortez's smirk faded. She hadn't expected fire, not like this. Not from someone the Western media still tried to paint as radical, unstable, or naive. But what stood before her wasn't a caricature. It was a man forged in post-colonial fire, a voice for a continent that had been talked down to for centuries, and wasn't interested in whispers anymore. And the chamber, once filled with Western pride, now felt like it was shrinking around her. Traoré hadn't just replied. He had turned the insult into a mirror, and held it to the face of the as Traoré's words faded, they didn't vanish, they rippled. Like shockwaves in still water, they spread through the chamber, unsettling every polished suit, every scripted mind. Ocasio-Cortez stood frozen, not out of fear, but disbelief. She had seen arrogance before. She had wielded it herself. But what Traoré radiated wasn't arrogance. It was authority born from suffering. An aide leaned toward AOC's ear, whispering frantically. She nodded slowly but didn't speak. Around her, senators, ambassadors, and delegates from the global north averted their eyes. The same people who had laughed moments before were now glued to their screens, scanning social media, watching as clips of Traoré's response already began to trend globally. Hashtags like #TraoréRises, #AfricanLion, and #cheering for Traoré exploded across X and TikTok. African youth, long mocked or ignored by the global stage, now had a face that stared power in the eye and didn't flinch. But inside the chamber, the storm had just begun. Traoré took a step closer, not toward AOC, but toward the central podium, uninvited. No one stopped him, not even security. His calm stride carried the weight of history. "I know what this place is," he said, turning slowly so every eye met his. "It's where empires pretend to be democracies. Where truth is sanitized, and freedom wears a tie." He locked eyes with a delegate from the UK, then France, then the US, his gaze like cold steel. "You ask who I represent? I represent those whose names never made it into your textbooks. Whose bodies fed your colonies. Whose silence made your wealth possible." The room grew colder. The truth did that. Ocasio-Cortez tried to interject, but Traoré held up a hand, not dismissive, but commanding. "You say I don't represent anyone," he repeated, voice lower now. "Then explain the fear in your voices, the urgency in your whispers. Why does a man from a nation you call small shake the walls of this hall?" The silence screamed louder than any response. Traoré wasn't just making a statement. He was carving his presence into the chamber's marble bones. No longer could they say Africa was just an audience in the theater of world power. Africa had become the actor. And Traoré, the scriptwriter. Ocasio-Cortez was used to commanding rooms. She could disarm senators with a glare, tilt headlines with a phrase, and summon applause with a well-timed pause. But now, she was a spectator. And her smile, the polished, camera-ready smirk she wore like armor, faltered. Not because she feared Traoré's words, but because she felt their weight. "He's shifting the axis," someone whispered behind her, perhaps a journalist, perhaps another delegate. The phrase hung in the air like prophecy, because it was true. Traoré wasn't debating. He was dismantling. He leaned slightly over the podium, voice calm but thunderous in its control. "You applauded leaders who bomb children in silence," he said, glancing at the U.S. and Israeli delegations. "You shook hands with tyrants while accusing others of tyranny. And now you say I don't belong?" A hushed gasp fluttered through the hall. "I don't belong in your club of hypocrisy. And I'm proud of it." Cameras flickered, capturing the fire in his eyes. Not rage, not vengeance, conviction. The kind that made people in distant cities stand up from their couches and whisper, "Finally." AOC cleared her throat. "This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Traoré. You don't get to deliver sermons." He turned to her slowly, almost pityingly. "I don't need a courtroom. The world is watching. And truth doesn't wait for permission." Silence again. But this time, it trembled. Even delegates who once stood firmly with the American bloc shifted uneasily. They sensed the momentum changing, not through armies, but through honesty. Traoré stepped back, just one pace. "Say what you want, Representative," he said, eyes never leaving hers. "But if my voice reaches the forgotten, the buried, the betrayed, then I don't need your permission. They've already chosen me." Behind him, applause erupted, not from the diplomats, but from the public gallery. Students, workers, activists, the ones whose voices had been muted for decades. And that was the moment the chamber changed, not because Traoré shouted, but because he didn't need to. The echo of the applause hadn't even died down before Traoré stepped forward again, not to speak louder, but to speak deeper. He didn't posture, he didn't gloat, he simply stood, like a monument that couldn't be ignored. AOC leaned in her chair, fingers laced tightly in her lap. "He's playing to the gallery," she muttered under her breath. But even she knew, this wasn't a performance. It was an unveiling. Traoré spoke again, voice softer now, but each word felt carved in stone. "You think I'm here to win a debate?" he asked, looking toward the U.S. delegation. "I'm not here to impress diplomats who shake hands with dictators by day and tweet about justice by night." He turned to the crowd, raising his hand, not in anger, but in remembrance. "I'm here for Sankara. For Lumumba. For every African whose name you never bothered to pronounce, but whose lands you drained dry." The room held its breath. He wasn't citing policies. He was resurrecting history. He continued, "You tell me I don't represent anyone. But I represent the silenced. I speak for those who die quietly when your bombs fall loudly." Cameras from international networks, Al Jazeera, RT, even independent live streamers, zoomed in, capturing the steel in his eyes. A fire not born of hate, but of clarity. This was not the language of revenge. It was the language of reckoning. And the audience knew it. Ocasio-Cortez rose slightly in her seat, trying to interject. "We've supported African nations." "No," Traoré's voice cracked the silence like a lightning bolt. "You supported their oppressors. You backed regimes that knelt to your banks, not to their people." Gasps erupted, not of offense, but of realization. Delegates glanced at each other, as if waking from a long political slumber. "And now you say I don't belong," he added, taking a final look across the chamber. He didn't wait for an answer. He was the answer. And the world was finally listening. The United Nations chamber, a hall once deafened by political theater and diplomatic rehearsals, now pulsed with something rare, conscience. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. No delegate shuffled papers. No aide whispered into an earpiece. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath after Traoré's final sentence. Ocasio-Cortez stood, her lips parted, but no sound emerged. For the first time, her sharpness dulled, not by shame, but by the uncomfortable weight of truth. She had faced opposition before, even scorn. But never had she been dismantled, not with slander, but with history. And Traoré didn't gloat. He simply sat. A calm settled over him like armor. He poured water into his glass and took a sip, as if he hadn't just shaken the foundations of global discourse. It wasn't performance. It was presence. The kind that doesn't demand attention, it commands it. From the African bloc, a slow, deliberate series of nods began. Guinea. Mali. Congo. Sudan. Delegates who'd once felt voiceless found their resolve reflected back in Traoré's defiance. Then, applause. Not thunderous, not showy. But steady. Purposeful. It began with a single clap from Burkina Faso's ambassador. Then another from Eritrea. Angola. Zimbabwe. Like sparks across dry grass, a slow blaze of solidarity ignited. And across the aisle, even some European representatives. Those often silent in matters of Africa, didn't speak, but didn't look away either. Traoré glanced toward Ocasio-Cortez one last time. She didn't meet his eyes. Not out of cowardice, but because she knew, this wasn't a man she could dismiss as a populist or paint as an extremist. He was the mirror no one wanted to face. In that silence, Traoré didn't just represent Africa. He centered it. And for the first time in that building's long, colonial-drenched history, Africa wasn't spoken for. It spoke back.
Within hours, the footage exploded. What happened inside the UN chamber didn't stay confined to diplomats and dignitaries. It spilled out, flooding every news feed, social platform, and living room screen from Johannesburg to Jakarta. CNN labeled it a diplomatic rift. Fox News spun it as Traoré's aggressive outburst. But the people, the ones the headlines rarely represented, called it something else, truth finally spoken out loud. Clips of Traoré's calm dismantling of Ocasio-Cortez trended globally. Hashtags like #AfricaSpeaks, #TraoréTruth, and #ColonialSilenceShattered surged to the top of Twitter and TikTok. On African news outlets, anchors didn't just report it, they celebrated it. "You saw it," said a South African journalist on air. A line was drawn. Not between nations, but between those who still cling to old power, and those building something new. In Harlem, Chicago, and Oakland, black communities watched Traoré's speech not as outsiders, but as heirs to the same struggles. Civil rights leaders reposted the moment Traoré asked Ocasio-Cortez, "Then why are they cheering?" as if he had asked it to every oppressor in every era. Even in Latin America, where indigenous activists often found themselves erased from global tables, Traoré's refusal to be dismissed became a rallying cry. He stood not just for Africa, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez faced a wave of unexpected backlash, not from conservatives, but from progressives. Writers who once defended her demanded an explanation. "Why did you undermine a man defending sovereignty and dignity?" one columnist wrote. "When did the left begin mimicking the arrogance of empire?" She issued a statement, measured, polished, and forgettable. But the moment had passed. Because while she was crafting a response, Traoré wasn't speaking. He was organizing. Behind closed doors, he met with the African delegation. "We've spoken loudly," he told them. "Now we build boldly. No more silence. No more begging. No more waiting." This wasn't a scandal. It was a signal. And the world, especially the ones who were never meant to have a voice, heard while headlines debated who won the exchange. Traoré had already moved past the theater. For him, victory wasn't in viral soundbites. It was in the plans forged after the applause faded. That night, as delegates filed into galas and journalists chased quotes, Traoré convened a private meeting with leaders from Mali, Chad, Ethiopia, and South Africa. No cameras. No translators. Just Africa speaking to itself. "We have waited long enough for respect," Traoré began, standing beneath a flickering chandelier in an old UN hall. "Now, we demand it, not with words, but with the structures of power we've been denied." He laid out a plan, clear, urgent, and unlike anything the West anticipated. A united economic bloc, free from IMF strings. A digital platform linking all African nations for resource tracking, trade, and education, built by African coders. A defense pact. A new diplomatic alliance with Latin America and Southeast Asia. Some leaders were hesitant. The risks were real: economic retaliation, political sabotage, even coups. But Traoré's voice didn't shake. "They already call us dangerous," he said. "Let's give them a reason to stop underestimating us." Word of the meeting leaked, intentionally. The next morning, Politico ran a headline: "Traoré plots African superpower." Western analysts scoffed. But in African capitals, young people whispered the phrase like it was prophecy. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez returned to her district, hoping the storm would pass. But something had shifted. Her staff noticed it first: emails from longtime supporters questioning her tone, her stance, her silence since. Because Traoré hadn't just challenged her. He had revealed something deeper: that too many leaders, even the ones wearing progressive badges, still thought leadership belonged to them. And not to those who had earned it through fire. And as the weeks unfolded, it became clear, this wasn't just a viral moment. It was the beginning of a geopolitical shift. And the man at the center wasn't asking for permission. He was setting the terms. Washington, London, Paris, power centers that once viewed Africa as a footnote, were now scrambling behind closed doors. Intelligence reports flooded in, marked with red ink and urgency. Traoré uniting African states. Potential oil-gold bloc forming. Digital currency bypassing dollar systems. What began as a bold exchange on a global stage had now rippled into boardrooms and war rooms. The CIA's Africa division held an emergency briefing. Traoré was no longer labeled just a populist or a revolutionary, he was now officially a strategic threat. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré stood on the balcony of a government building, looking out over a square where thousands had gathered. Not to protest. To volunteer. Farmers, students, artists, engineers, all offering their skills to build something that hadn't been attempted in generations, a sovereign Africa that asked no permission and feared no rejection. He addressed the crowd not as a president, but as a brother. "They said we were too divided. Too poor. Too broken to rise. They thought we needed their hands to lift us. They never realized we were rising while they looked away." The crowd erupted, but this time it wasn't just cheering. It was commitment. Across Africa, his speech was broadcast over radios in remote villages and streamed on phones in cities. WhatsApp groups overflowed with translations. Even in oppressed regions, dissidents whispered his name like a spark that refused to die. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez released a carefully worded statement, trying to reclaim her position. But it fell flat. The world had seen her dismissiveness. And they had seen Traoré's resolve. The UN, once again, tried to call for unity and dialogue. But Traoré no longer played by their clock or cadence. He wasn't just representing Burkina Faso anymore. He was representing an awakening. And for the first time in decades, the West wasn't leading the conversation. They were chasing it. Weeks after the exchange that set the world ablaze, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attempted damage control. She appeared on CNN, MSNBC, even TikTok live streams, reframing her words, softening her tone, speaking about misunderstandings and cross-cultural miscommunications. But it was too late. The internet had already immortalized the moment Traoré shattered her carefully crafted image. Across Africa and the global south, meme pages posted side-by-side shots, AOC fuming, Traoré calm and smiling. Hashtags like hashtag TrueVoice, hashtag Traoré effect, and hashtag Africarizing trended on X and Instagram for days. Every attempt AOC made to reassert her progressive brand only made her look more detached, more exposed. But Traoré didn't respond with another soundbite. He responded with action. He flew to Addis Ababa to meet with leaders from Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa. The meeting wasn't just diplomatic, it was historic. There, in a candlelit chamber filled with centuries of ancestral memory, they signed the Ouagadougou Declaration, a multilateral pact for economic independence, regional defense, and technological integration, free from Western intermediaries. Reporters begged for comment. Cameras followed him to the tarmac. A young journalist asked, "Mr. President, are you trying to replace the West?" Traoré paused, his voice quiet but clear. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to remind Africa of who we are. Before we were ruled, we ruled. Before we were divided, we created. And before they called us poor, we were rich beyond gold." Back in Washington, AOC sat silently in a closed-door strategy meeting, the glow of her phone showing Traoré's face mid-speech, projected by millions across the globe. And it hit her. She hadn't just lost an argument. She had helped ignite a revolution. Weeks turned into months, but the echo of Traoré's words refused to fade. What began as a verbal clash in a sterile UN chamber had spiraled into something seismic. Across continents, a new consciousness surged, young, angry, proud. African students in Dakar, Lagos, and Johannesburg formed forums titled, "Why Are They Cheering?" Latin American activists reposted the Traoré-AOC exchange with subtitles in Spanish and Portuguese. Even in European capitals, youth protests referenced his name. Not as a leader of a single country, but as a symbol. In the US, Ocasio-Cortez approval ratings dipped. Her staff tried burying the incident under new initiatives and public relations spins. But every time she stepped on stage, a voice from the crowd would yell. But why were they cheering? She had mocked a man she thought stood alone. But the applause had proven otherwise. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré stood on the steps of a new Pan-African university, his silhouette outlined by the sun. He wasn't speaking to diplomats, but to farmers, teachers, refugees, and students. His message wasn't about revenge or conquest. It was about reclamation. "They say we don't belong at their tables," he said calmly. "Let them keep their tables. We are building our own house." Cheers erupted, not polite applause, but the deep, roaring kind that shakes the bones of history. This time, there were no foreign correspondents to filter it. No spin doctors. Just raw sound, millions of voices rising in affirmation. Far away, AOC sat alone in her office, the lights dim, the screen glowing with another viral clip of Traoré's speech. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. Because now she understood. He didn't need her validation. He never had. And the world? The world had already chosen who it was listening to.